The silence in Ilara's cottage was a living thing, a cold, hollow beast that gnawed deeper than the winter wind seeping through the walls. It was the silence of 9 empty bellies, the quiet accusation in the eyes of her children as they watched her break their last loaf of stale bread into impossibly small pieces. This was her world, a landscape of perpetual hunger, painted in the muted greys of poverty and the stark white of fear. Her love for them was a fierce, burning sun, yet it could not warm their chilled hands or fill the aching void in their stomachs. The weight of their survival pressed down on her, a physical force threatening to shatter her bones. This feeling of desperation, of being pushed to the absolute edge, is a language we all understand. I want you to connect with this story, so tell me in the comments, what is your name, where are you watching this from, and what time is it in your world? And please, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the journey that is about to unfold. Her existence in the small human village of Oakhaven was a constant, low-grade humiliation. She was Ilara, the widow, a cautionary tale whispered by mothers to their daughters. With 9 children, she was a living symbol of reckless indulgence in a time of brutal scarcity. Her family seen not as a legacy of love, but as a blight on the community's meager resources. When she walked through the muddy market square, a trail of her younger children clutching her worn skirt, conversations would falter. Eyes would either slide away in pity or linger with a cold, judgmental glint. The baker would sigh as he handed her the day-old bread she could barely afford, his expression a mixture of charity and resentment. She carried the ghost of her husband, a man of laughter and strength, like a shield, but it was growing thin against the daily onslaught of scorn. She was an outcast, isolated by the very love that defined her. Every night, after the children were asleep, their gentle breaths filling the small space with a fragile peace, Ilara would finally allow the exhaustion to claim her. It was a bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical labor. It was the fatigue of constant worry, of calculating and recalculating every last copper coin, of mending clothes until the patches had patches of their own. She was trapped in a relentless cycle of just barely enough, a cycle that was slowly grinding her spirit into dust. In these quiet, lonely hours, a secret desire would surface, a shameful, desperate yearning, not for wealth or power, but simply for a moment of peace. A world where she could look at her children and feel only pride, not the crushing weight of her own inadequacy. She didn't want to escape them. She wanted to be worthy of them, to be seen not for the mouths she struggled to feed, but for the unwavering strength of her heart. The delicate balance of her precarious life shattered when her youngest, little Lyra, fell ill. It was not a common winter sickness of coughs and fevers. This was something alien, a malady that seemed to drift in from the edges of the world, from the shimmering, unstable border of the Feylands. A strange, silver-blue pallor crept over Lyra's skin, and at night a faint, ethereal light pulsed beneath her eyelids. The village healer was useless, his herbs and poultices having no effect on a sickness that felt more magical than natural. Ilara watched, helpless, as her daughter faded, her small body growing colder, her breath becoming a shallow whisper. The fear that had been her constant companion now transformed into a raw, primal terror. Poverty was a slow death she could fight, but this sickness was a swift, silent thief stealing her child from her arms. Desperation became her guide, silencing the ingrained fear of the forbidden lands that bordered their village. The Silverwood, the ancient domain of the elf king Theron, was a place of legend and terror, a realm from which humans never returned. Stories told to frighten children spoke of its cold, immortal ruler and the strange, dangerous magic that saturated its air, but the stories of the elves also whispered of powerful remedies, of a magic that could mend what was broken in the mortal world. Holding Lyra's limp hand, feeling the unnatural chill of her skin, Ilara made a choice. The fear of the unknown was nothing compared to the certainty of her loss. With a grim resolve that hardened her face into a mask of stone, she wrapped her thinnest cloak around her shoulders, her destination set. She would walk into the forbidden woods and face whatever monsters lay within, for the monster of her daughter's death was one she could not bear. The past was a ghost that walked beside Ilara, not a spectre of horror, but a warm, sunlit memory that made the present winter feel all the colder. She remembered Cale, her husband, with a clarity that was a constant, bitter-sweet ache. He was a man carved from laughter and sunlight, his hands calloused from his work as a woodsman, but gentle in the way they held his children, or her. Their love had been an unapologetic, vibrant thing. They hadn't planned for 9 children. They had simply loved, and life had bloomed from that love. Each new baby, a joyous surprise, a further testament to their bond. They had dreamed of a house filled with the chaos of their growing family, of Cale teaching his sons his trade, and her teaching their daughters the songs of the old world. His death, a sudden fever that stole him in a matter of days, hadn't just taken her husband. It had stolen the architect of her world, leaving her to build a life from the ruins of their shared dreams. His final words were not a declaration of love, but a desperate, whispered command, a burden he had passed to her with his last rattling breath. Keep them safe, Ilara. Keep them together. That promise had become the bedrock of her existence, a sacred vow that chained her to a life of relentless struggle. It was why she never considered sending any of her older children away to apprenticeships in other villages, a common practice that would have eased her load immeasurably. In her mind, that would be a betrayal, a splintering of the one whole thing Cale had left her. This vow was her shield against the world's judgment, but it was also the heaviest stone in her heart. Every hungry night, every worn-out pair of shoes, every pitying glance was a fresh reminder of her potential failure, the fear that she was not strong enough to honor the last wish of the man she had loved more than life itself. This self-imposed isolation, this fierce maternal protection, only served to deepen the chasm between her and the village. The scorn she faced was a daily erosion of her spirit. She remembered with searing clarity the day the weaver's wife, a woman whose own belly was round with her 3rd child, had looked at Ilara's trailing flock of children and remarked loud enough for half the market to hear, "Some people breed like rabbits, with no thought for the winter." The shame had been a physical blow, hot and sharp, stealing the air from her lungs. She had gathered her children close, her face a stoic mask, but inside she had crumbled. This constant judgment had carved a deep wound of worthlessness within her. She began to see herself through their eyes, not as a loving mother, but as a burden, a failure, a walking symbol of poor choices and bad luck. The contempt of her peers became her own internal voice. Because of this, the very idea of romance, of letting another person into the fragile, embattled fortress of her life, was an absurdity, a cruel joke. Love was a language she no longer spoke. It was a luxury for women who had time for daydreams, for women whose hearts weren't shattered and repurposed as a shield. To love again would be to risk another loss, another gaping wound she knew she would not survive. More than that, it would be an unforgivable vulnerability. How could she trust a man to understand the sacred weight of her promise to Cale? How could she expose her children to the potential instability of another person's whims? Her heart was not just closed, it was bricked over, sealed with the mortar of grief and responsibility. It had room only for her 9 children, and every inch of that space was dedicated to their survival. Her journey into the Silverwood was a pilgrimage born of that singular, desperate love. Every snapping twig under her worn boots sounded like a breaking bone. and the ancient trees seemed to lean in, their silver-barked limbs twisted into shapes of judgment. The air grew thin and cold, humming with an energy that felt alien and alive, a stark contrast to the familiar, earthy magic of the human world. Fear was a coiling serpent in her gut, whispering tales of mortals driven mad by the wood's ethereal beauty or ensnared by cruel fey tricks. But for every wave of terror that threatened to turn her back, the image of Lyra's face, pale and still, with that unnatural silver-blue light pulsing beneath her skin, rose in her mind. That image was her talisman against the encroaching dread. The unknown horrors of this forbidden forest were nothing compared to the certain horror of watching her child die. She stumbled through a veil of shimmering mist and found herself in a place that defied mortal architecture, a clearing where monolithic white stones rose toward the sky like the bleached bones of a god, stood before a structure that seemed woven from moonlight and living wood. Before she could even process the impossible sight, two figures materialized from the shadows. They were elven guards, tall and slender, clad in armor like spun silver. Their beauty was terrifying, inhumanly perfect and devoid of warmth. They moved with a liquid grace that made her feel clumsy and coarse, a creature of mud and dirt in their pristine world. When she tried to speak, her voice a hoarse croak as she begged for an audience, for a healer, for any mercy they could offer. They simply stared. Their violet eyes held no pity, only a chilling, ancient indifference, as if her frantic desperation was nothing more than the meaningless scurrying of an insect. Just as one of the guards raised a hand, a gesture of final, silent dismissal that would have shattered her last sliver of hope, a new voice cut through the cold air. It was not loud, yet it resonated through the clearing, commanding the very stones to listen. "Bring her to me." The voice was laced with an authority as old as the trees and a weariness as deep as their roots. The guards froze, their impassive faces instantly shifting to expressions of absolute, unquestioning obedience. They turned back to Ilara, their gazes now holding a flicker of something new, not kindness, but a profound, unnerving gravity. Without a word of explanation, they each took one of her arms. Their touch was surprisingly gentle, but held the unyielding strength of ancient stone. They began to lead her forward, away from the world she knew and deeper into the heart of the elven domain, a bewildered prisoner of a summons she could not possibly comprehend. She was led into a hall that seemed carved from a single, colossal geode, its crystalline walls refracting the ethereal light into 1,000 shimmering rainbows. The air was cold and still, smelling of winter ozone and ancient stone, so quiet she could hear the frantic, terrified thudding of her own heart. At the far end of the immense chamber, upon a throne that looked like it was woven from frozen moonlight, sat the source of the commanding voice. King Theron was not a man, he was a living statue of impossible perfection and profound sorrow. His hair was the color of spun silver, cascading over shoulders clad in armor that seemed to mimic the night sky. His face was a masterpiece of sharp, elegant lines, but it was his eyes, the color of amethysts, that held her captive. They were ancient, weary, and held the chilling stillness of a frozen lake, reflecting a grief too old for a mortal heart to comprehend. From his elevated perch, Theron watched the human woman being escorted toward him. Her worn clothes and dirt-smudged face a jarring stain against the pristine perfection of his court. He saw more than her poverty. He saw the chaotic, untamed aura of life clinging to her like a second skin. It was a vibrancy his world had long forgotten. He was the king of a dying people, presiding over a slow, silent apocalypse known as the Fading. It was a creeping sterility, a magical decay that thinned their blood and severed their connection to the world's life force. Every day he saw it in the listless eyes of his subjects, in the barren wombs of the elven women, and in the greying leaves of the sacred silverwood itself. His crown was not a symbol of power, but a monument to his failure. Each polished point a reminder of the thousands of souls whose future rested on his increasingly desperate decisions. The pressure from his own council was a constant venomous whisper in the hollow halls of his palace. Lord Valerius, his oldest advisor and a staunch traditionalist, led a faction that viewed his pursuit of the prophecy as the ultimate heresy. To them, the purity of their ancient bloodline was more sacred than survival itself. They would rather fade into a noble, tragic memory than pollute their lineage with mortal blood. They saw his desperation not as the mark of a determined king, but as a weakness, a sacrilegious bargain that would degrade their entire civilization. Theron knew that by bringing this human into his sanctum, he was not just defying tradition, he was drawing a line in the sand, challenging the very core of his people's identity and potentially igniting a civil war between his dwindling loyalists and the powerful purists who would see him fail. Beneath the cold, regal stoicism he projected was a loneliness so profound it had become a part of his very being. As an immortal, he had watched centuries turn to dust. But now he was watching his entire world slowly crumble into nothingness. The silence of the royal nursery, a place that had once echoed with the laughter of elven children, was a constant, torturous scream in his mind. He walked the halls of his ancestors, haunted by the spectre of a future where he would be the last of his kind, the sole guardian of a magnificent, empty tomb. The ancient prophecy, once a piece of forgotten lore, had become his only lifeline. A single, desperate gamble against the encroaching darkness. He was not just a king fighting for his kingdom. He was a terrified man fighting against the crushing, absolute finality of being utterly and completely alone for eternity. His gaze fixed on Ilara, who now stood trembling at the foot of his dais. The seers had been clear. Only a union with a mortal of abundant life could break the curse. And she was the living embodiment of that phrase. It wasn't merely that she had borne 9 children, a feat now physically impossible for any elf. It was the fierce, defiant resilience that radiated from her, a raw life force forged in hardship and fueled by a love so powerful it was a tangible energy in the sterile air of his hall. He saw in her the chaos of birth, the messiness of survival, the untamed spirit his people had traded for cold perfection and eternal order centuries ago. She was the antidote to their slow decay, a dose of raw, mortal vitality. He needed her, not just as a vessel for an heir, but as a catalyst to reignite the very spark of life his people had lost. Theron rose from his throne, the movement fluid and silent, yet it carried the weight of a collapsing mountain. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice a low resonance that vibrated through the crystal floor. The guards bowed as one and vanished into the shadows, leaving Ilara utterly alone with the terrifyingly powerful being. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing the frantic beat of her heart. She was a trespasser, a beggar from a muddy village who had dared to enter this sacred realm. Punishment was inevitable. She expected to be struck down, her life extinguished for her audacity. Her entire body braced for the blow. He stopped just before her, a towering figure of silver and shadow, his amethyst eyes boring into hers. His expression was an unreadable mask of ancient power, and when he finally spoke, his words were not a sentence of death, but a command that sealed her fate. "Tell me your name." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the cavernous silence. She forced the words past a throat constricted with terror, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo off the crystalline walls. "My name is Ilara," the Elf King. Theron did not move, but his amethyst eyes consumed her. He saw the frayed hem of her cloak, the exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, the defiant tremor in her chin. He was seeing more than a desperate human. He was seeing the chaotic, untamed, fertile energy of life itself, a force his sterile world had long since forgotten. He began to circle her slowly, his movements as fluid and silent as a panther's. His presence was an overwhelming physical pressure, a suffocating aura of ancient power and profound sorrow that made the air feel thin and hard to breathe. He was not merely assessing a trespasser, he was examining the last hope of his civilization. He stopped his predatory circling and stood before her, a towering figure of silver and shadow. When he spoke, his voice was no longer a sharp command, but a low, resonant murmur filled with the weight of fading stars. "My people are dying, Elara," he said, the words stripped of all royal artifice, leaving only a raw, ancient grief. He told her of the fading, describing it not as a curse, but as a slow, silent winter of the soul that was freezing his kingdom from the inside out. He spoke of the sacred trees of the Silverwood, whose leaves were now tinged with grey, of the quiet despair that haunted the timelessly beautiful faces of his subjects, and of the hollow, echoing silence in the royal nurseries, which had not heard the cry of a newborn elf in centuries. He was not a king lamenting a political crisis. He was a father confessing the slow, inexorable death of his entire family. His gaze, heavy with that impossible burden, remained fixed on her. "There is a prophecy," he continued, his voice barely disturbing the frigid air. "An old piece of lore, long dismissed as a fable. It speaks of a single, desperate remedy." He explained that their own magic, once potent enough to shape mountains, was now thinning like mist, too weak to fight the creeping decay. The only hope, the prophecy claimed, was an infusion of vitality from the outside, a graft of mortal life onto their dying, immortal tree. "It requires a union," he stated, the words precise and deliberate, "with a mortal of abundant life." The phrase hung between them, a tangible thing in the shimmering light of the hall. It was then that Elara understood. He wasn't just looking at her. He was seeing her 9 children, her struggle, her fierce, desperate love, as the living answer to his prayers. He did not court her with pretty words or gentle persuasion. He laid out his offer with the cold, brutal clarity of a man making a final, desperate move in a game he could not afford to lose. "Your youngest child, Lyra," he began, his tone leaving no room for negotiation, "is dying from a sickness born of my world's decay. I can heal her. I can purge the fey magic from her veins and make her whole again." He paused, letting the weight of that promise sink in. "Furthermore, I will give you and all 9 of your children sanctuary within these walls. They will never know hunger again. They will be clothed in silks, educated by the finest elven tutors, and protected by the full power of my throne. I will grant them a life of security and privilege beyond your mortal imaginings." The offer was a sunburst in the darkness of her life, so impossibly bright it was blinding. Then, with the same chilling calm, he delivered the price for this miracle. "In return," he said, his amethyst eyes boring into her, stripping away every last one of her defenses, "you will bind yourself to me. You will become my queen." The title was so absurd, so utterly alien to her reality, that she felt a dizzying wave of disbelief. He explained the pact in stark, emotionless terms. It would be a marriage of state, a political and magical contract designed for a single purpose. She would be his consort, a living symbol of the last hope for his people. And then he stated her final, most critical duty, the true heart of their bargain. "You will give my kingdom what it needs most," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more powerful than a shout. "You will give me an heir." Elara's world tilted on its axis. The offer was a monstrous, beautiful thing, a choice between 2 impossibilities. It was a trade of her very self, her body, her freedom, her heart, for the absolute security of her children. The mother in her, the woman who had spent years fighting a losing war against starvation and despair, screamed at her to accept warm beds, full bellies, a future free from the gnawing fear that haunted her every waking moment. It was the answer to every desperate prayer she had ever whispered into the cold night. Yet, the woman inside the mother recoiled. To be a vessel, a broodmare for a cold, immortal king in a golden cage. The scorn she endured in her village was a dull ache. The contempt she would face from a court of perfect, ancient beings would be a constant, razor-sharp torment. It was a sacrifice of her soul for their survival. She looked up at the towering figure before her, forcing herself to see past the terrifying power, past the inhuman perfection. For one breathtaking instant, the regal mask slipped, and she saw him for what he was, a man as trapped and desperate as she was. He was a king chained to the fate of his people, his crown a heavier burden than her poverty. In his eyes, she did not see a tyrant, but a fellow prisoner of circumstance. This flicker of shared desperation did not make him less terrifying, but it made him understandable. Her mind flashed to Lyra's pale face, the unnatural silver-blue light pulsing beneath her skin. She heard Kyle's last desperate whisper, "Keep them safe, keep them together." This horrifying, miraculous pact was the only path left to honor that promise. It was salvation, wrapped in the chains of servitude. A deep, shuddering breath filled her lungs, and with it came a resolve forged in the fires of maternal love. The fear was still a living thing coiling in her gut, but it was no longer her master. She met the Elf King's gaze, her own eyes, which had held only terror moments before, now shining with a defiant, steely light. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady, a small human sound that held its own against the immense ancient silence of the hall. She saw a flicker of something, not relief, but perhaps acknowledgement, in the depths of his amethyst eyes before his mask of stoicism settled once more. But she was not finished. "I have a condition," she added, her words sharp and precise. "My children will not be your wards, hidden away like shameful secrets. If I am to be your queen, they will be recognized by you and by your entire court. They will be named princes and princesses of the Silverwood, with every right and protection that title affords." The ceremony was not a celebration of love, but a stark, magical transaction conducted in the chilling silence of the throne hall. There were no flowers, no music, only the low, resonant hum of ancient power that seemed to emanate from the crystal walls themselves. Ilara stood on the dais beside Theron, a small, worn figure of brown wool and fierce determination amidst a sea of ethereal elves clad in silks and silver. The court had assembled, their perfect, emotionless faces a gallery of silent judgment. She could feel the weight of their ancient eyes, particularly the cold, venomous stare of Lord Valerius, whose disapproval was a palpable force in the frigid air. The officiant, an elf so old his skin resembled polished marble, began the incantation in a language that felt like cracking ice, each word a cold link in the chain that was about to bind her life to the Elf Kings. Theron listened to the familiar words of the binding rite, a ceremony that hadn't been performed in over 500 years. He felt the full, crushing weight of his decision settle upon his shoulders. Every disapproving glance from his council was a fresh wound to his pride, a reminder that he was staking the very soul of his people on a forgotten prophecy and a mortal woman. He looked at Ilara, noting the faint tremor in her hands, a stark contrast to the unyielding resolve in her eyes. She was terrified, yet she stood her ground, a small, defiant flame in his cold, dying world. He had chosen her for her abundant life, for the biological miracle of her 9 children. But in that moment, he recognized a different kind of vitality, a strength forged in hardship that his own people, in their long, placid decline, had completely forgotten. For Ilara, the world had narrowed to a single, sharp point of focus. The alien words of the ceremony washed over her, meaningless sounds against the frantic, silent prayer she repeated in her mind. Her gaze kept drifting to a shadowed alcove where her 9 children stood, huddled together under the watchful eyes of the royal guard. Lyra was there, her skin still tinged with that unnatural silver blue, but her eyes were open, watching her mother with a dawning awareness. The sight of them, her precious, vulnerable flock, was the anchor that kept her from dissolving into pure terror. This golden cage was their salvation. This sacrifice of her freedom was their future. When the officiant paused, signaling her turn to speak the vows, she drew a steadying breath, tasting the sterile ozone-tinged air, and repeated the foreign phrases with a clear, unwavering voice that defied the condemnation surrounding her. The ritual culminated not with the exchange of rings, a mortal custom of sentiment, but with a direct binding of life force. The officiant gestured for their hands. Theron extended his long, elegant fingers held perfectly still. Hesitantly, Ilara placed her calloused, work-worn hand in his. The moment their skin touched, a palpable shock coursed through them both. His hand was cool and smooth like riverstone, yet a startling, unexpected energy pulsed beneath the surface. For him, her touch was a jolt of chaotic warmth, a raw, vibrant heat that felt utterly alien to his own controlled existence. As the final binding word was spoken, a thread of brilliant, golden light erupted from her palm, weaving itself around a similar strand of pure silver light emanating from his, a visible manifestation of their 2 worlds colliding and intertwining in an unbreakable, magical knot. A collective gasp swept through the assembled court. The intensity of the magical light was far greater than the ancient texts had described, a brilliant, almost violent flare of power that illuminated the entire hall in a cascade of silver and gold. Lord Valerius took an involuntary step back, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. To him and the other purists, this was not a sign of hope. It was a perversion, a grotesque corruption of their sacred magic by the chaotic, untamed essence of a lesser being. The initial shock quickly curdled into a wave of furious, fearful whispers that spread through the ranks of the nobility like wildfire. They were witnessing the sealing of their king's desperate pact, but they were also seeing the potential birth of a magical heresy that could shatter their civilization more completely than the fading ever could. To finalize the rite, a public seal was required. Theron turned to her, his movements as fluid and deliberate as always. Though Ilara could now feel a faint, high-frequency vibration humming through the hand he still held. He leaned in, his silver hair brushing against her cheek, his scent like winter air and ancient stone. He had intended the kiss to be a mere formality, a cold, chaste press of lips to satisfy the demands of the ceremony and the watchful eyes of his court. But the moment his mouth met hers, the carefully constructed wall of regal detachment around him fractured. Her lips were soft and unexpectedly warm, a shocking point of living, breathing reality in his sterile existence. For an infinitesimal second, he was overwhelmed by a purely sensory impression, the taste of mortal sorrow, resilience, and a fierce, untamed life force. Ilara had braced herself for the touch of cold marble, for a kiss that felt like a death sentence being signed. The reality was a disorienting shock that stole the breath from her lungs. There was a surprising heat in his touch, a spark of dormant energy that arced between them, far more intimate and revealing than any physical embrace. It was not a kiss of affection or passion, but something far deeper and more terrifying. In that fleeting contact, she felt an echo of his immense, crushing loneliness. the weight of centuries pressing down on a soul that had forgotten the warmth of the sun. And in turn, he seemed to recoil slightly, as if he had been burned by the sheer, unbridled intensity of her desperate, all-consuming love for her children, a force as raw and powerful as a storm. They pulled apart, the echo of the connection still shimmering in the air between them. Theron's amethyst eyes, usually so distant and controlled, were wide with a flicker of profound shock, a momentary crack in his immortal composure before the mask of the stoic king slammed back into place. Ilara's heart was a wild drum against her ribs, but the feeling was no longer just fear. It was a new, deeply unsettling awareness that the terms of their contract had just been fundamentally rewritten by a force neither of them controlled. The pact was meant to be clinical, a joining of purpose, not of souls, but that brief, electrifying touch had exposed the truth. Their shared desperation had created a conduit for something far more volatile and unpredictable than a simple magical agreement. Theron straightened, releasing her hand as if it had burned him. He turned to face his silent, watchful court, his voice regaining its full, resonant authority, echoing through the vast hall and commanding absolute attention. "Before you stands Ilara, Queen of the Silverwood," he announced, the title landing with the force of a physical blow. He then turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon the alcove. "And these," he continued, his tone sharp, daring any to challenge him, "are the princes and princesses of this realm. From this day forward, they are to be given every protection, every honor, and every privilege that their new station affords." It was the fulfillment of his promise to her, but it was also a gauntlet thrown down, a direct and public defiance of Lord Valerius and the powerful purist faction that sought to undermine their union at every turn. As the court, led by a visibly seething Valerius, offered a stiff, synchronized bow of reluctant acceptance, Theron's gaze returned to Ilara. His face was once again an unreadable mask of regal indifference, yet his eyes held a new, unsettling depth. The ceremony was over, the pact sealed in the eyes of his people and the laws of magic. But as he looked at his new human queen, he knew with a chilling certainty that the true danger had only just begun. The binding had worked, perhaps too well. The unexpected surge of power, the disorienting intimacy of the kiss, it all pointed to a perilous complication. The magic they had invoked was not a simple tool to be wielded. It was alive, and it had woven their fates together far more tightly than a mere contract ever could, promising a future of unimaginable consequence. The days that followed were a disorienting blend of opulence and isolation. Ilara and her children lived in a suite of rooms so vast and ornate they felt like a miniature kingdom unto themselves, with ceilings painted like the twilight sky and beds draped in fabrics as soft as mist. Yet, this luxury was a gilded cage. The palace was a place of profound, unnerving silence, broken only by the jarringly human sounds of her own family. Her children's laughter, which had once been the music of her life, now echoed strangely in the cold, crystalline halls, drawing disapproving, fleeting glances from the silent elven servants who moved like ghosts along the periphery. She felt like a common sparrow trapped in a cage of spun moonlight, her every move watched, her every sound a disruption to the ancient, sorrowful peace of the Silverwood. Her children were safe and fed, but they were also exhibits in a museum of a dying race. A fragile, unspoken routine began to form between Ilara and the king. They shared their evening meal in a smaller, private dining hall, the long, polished table, a vast, empty continent between them. The conversations were stilted, focused on the children's lessons or the mundane details of palace life. Yet, in these quiet moments, Ilara began to see the cracks in his regal facade. She watched him observe her son, Finn, attempting to carve a piece of wood with a small elven blade, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a fleeting moment, the king's amethyst eyes held not the weariness of a monarch, but a deep, ancient longing, a profound sorrow for a future he feared would never come. It was in these unguarded seconds, when he forgot he was a king and was simply a man watching a child, that a strange, dangerous current of understanding began to flow between them. The court's contempt was not overt, but a constant, low-grade poison in the air she breathed. It manifested in the way the noble ladies would fall silent when she entered a room, their eyes lingering on her simple, human-made gown, before turning away with the faintest, most dismissive of smiles. The true venom came from Lord Valerius. During a formal gathering in the Great Hall, as her twin daughters, Anya and Elena, chased each other in a rare moment of uninhibited joy, he approached her side. "One must forgive their exuberance," he murmured, his voice a silken blade. "Mortal creatures are so full of chaotic, fleeting energy. It is a shame they lack the grace to contain it. It must be a constant trial for you, Your Majesty." The honorific was a deliberate mockery, each syllable dripping with condescension, a public reminder that she was an outsider, a necessary but distasteful tool. Theron, who had been observing from across the hall, moved with a speed that was both silent and startling. He appeared at Valerius's side, his presence a sudden drop in temperature. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Lord Valerius," he said, his tone as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "The Queen's children are the future of this realm. Their energy is not chaos, it is life. It is the very thing our kingdom has been starving for. You would do well to remember that the sound of their joy is the sound of our hope. Do not mistake it for anything less." He did not look at Valerius as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the children. But the rebuke was absolute, a public chastisement that left the ancient lord pale with fury and the surrounding nobles frozen in a stunned, terrified silence. He had defended the pact, not her, but the shield he extended covered her all the same. Later that night, Elara found she couldn't sleep. She walked out onto a balcony that overlooked a moon-drenched garden of crystalline flora that shimmered with an inner light. The silence pressed in on her, a suffocating blanket of loneliness. She heard a soft footfall and turned to see Theron standing in the doorway, a tall silver shadow against the light of the hall. "He will not speak to you that way again," he said, his voice a low resonance in the quiet air. Elara simply nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice small. "It is my duty to protect the crown," he answered, the reply automatic, impersonal. But then he hesitated, his gaze dropping to the glowing garden. "And all that it represents," he added, his voice softer, imbued with a meaning that hung unspoken between them. A fragile admission that she was now part of that representation. The true turning point came not through words, but through the innocent actions of her youngest. Lyra, now fully recovered, her skin clear and her eyes bright, had grown fearless in the silent palace. She wandered into the royal library one afternoon, where Theron was poring over ancient maps. Instead of being intimidated by the towering figure, she walked straight up to him, holding a small, silver-leafed flower. "This fell," she said, her small voice clear as a bell. "It is sad now." Theron froze, looking down at the small child and the wilting flower in her hand. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then, with a slowness that seemed to defy his nature, he reached out a single, elegant finger and touched the center of the bloom. A soft, silver light pulsed from his fingertip, and the flower instantly revived, its petals unfurling in perfect, vibrant health. Lyra gasped in delight, and Elara, watching from the doorway, felt her own heart skip a beat. The purist faction, however, was not so easily swayed. Valerius, smarting from his public humiliation, grew more insidious in his attacks. During a formal council meeting to which Ilara had been summoned, he began to systematically dismantle her worthiness. He questioned her knowledge of elven history, her understanding of their magical traditions, and her ability to navigate the complex alliances of the Fey courts. The Queen is a simple creature of the mortal world, he argued, his words directed at the assembled lords, but intended to cut her to the bone. She brings with her a legacy of hunger and desperation. How can such a vessel possibly bear the weight of our kingdom's future? We are entrusting our very survival to a peasant whose greatest achievement is a shocking and reckless fertility. The insult was devastatingly precise, striking at the core of her deepest insecurities. Before Ilara could even form a response, before the hot sting of shame could fully register, Theron rose from his throne. The movement was not slow or deliberate. It was a sudden, violent surge of power that made the very air in the chamber crackle. Enough. His voice was not a shout, but a roar of pure, unadulterated fury that slammed into the council like a physical blow. He descended the dais, his eyes burning with a terrifying amethyst light, and stopped directly in front of a stunned Valerius. "You speak of her legacy," he snarled, his voice low and lethal. "Her legacy is survival. Her legacy is a love so fierce it burns away despair. She has fought for every breath her children have ever taken. A battle you, in your cold, sterile privilege, cannot even begin to comprehend. She is not a vessel. She is Ilara. She is my queen. And you will address her with the respect she is owed, or you will be addressing me from the dungeons." The silence that followed was absolute and profound. The assembled lords, including Valerius, were paralyzed, not just by the king's fury, but by the raw, possessive, and deeply personal nature of his defense. He had not defended a political asset. He had defended a woman. He had defended his woman. He turned his back on the council, his gaze finding Ilara's across the chamber. In his eyes, the fire of his rage still burned, but beneath it was something else, something wild and vulnerable and utterly shocking. It was a look that stripped away the titles of king and queen, leaving only a man and a woman bound by a pact that was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous. The carefully constructed walls of their arrangement had just been obliterated, and in the ruins, a terrifying and undeniable truth was beginning to take root. That night, the space between them was no longer a chasm of silence, but a field of electric tension. He did not come to her chambers, nor she to his, but they were more aware of each other than ever before. Ilara lay in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, replaying his words, his voice. The burning light in his eyes. She is Ilara. She is my queen. He had said her name with a force that seemed to claim it, to claim her. The pretense was gone. This was no longer a simple contract, a trade of security for an heir. His defense of her had been an act of profound intimacy, a public declaration of a bond that went far beyond the magical rite. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, with a thrill of terror and a flicker of hope, if this cold, immortal king was capable of feeling anything for her at all. The question was a dangerous one. Were they still just pretending? Theron stood on his own balcony, the cold night air doing nothing to quell the storm raging within him. His outburst in the council chamber had been an instinctual, primal reaction that had shaken him to his core. He had felt Valerius's words like a physical assault, not against his crown, but against Ilara herself. Her quiet strength, her unwavering dignity in the face of their scorn, had ignited a protective instinct he thought had faded with the rest of his people's vitality. He was a king who had made a desperate, logical bargain to save his race. But when he had looked at her, standing small and alone before the judgment of his council, logic had fled. He had acted not as a king, but as a man defending something precious. He was playing with a fire he did not understand, and he knew with a chilling certainty that they were both about to be burned. Their fragile, unspoken truce was shattered the next morning. A stern-faced delegation from the council, led by a still pale but defiant Lord Valerius, requested an immediate audience. They stood before the throne, their faces grim. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his voice stiff with formality, "the council has deliberated. Your passionate defense of the Queen has done little to quell the growing unrest. The fading worsens with each passing day, and we have yet to see any sign of the prophecy's fulfillment." He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air. "Therefore, we are invoking the right of quickening. An ancient law demands that when the royal line is in peril, a fertility ceremony must be performed before the next full moon. It is a public ritual, designed to test the union's magical viability and encourage a result. The demand was a political checkmate, a new public humiliation designed to force their hand and expose their fragile bond to the cold, unforgiving scrutiny of the entire kingdom. The council's demand for a right of quickening landed like a physical blow, shattering the fragile peace that had begun to settle in Ilara's heart. That evening, she confronted Theron in the cold expanse of the royal library, the silence between them more hostile than any shouted words. "A public ceremony?" she asked, her voice trembling with a fury born of deep humiliation. "So your entire court can watch and judge, to see if the mortal broodmare is performing as she should?" She felt every ounce of the court's contempt coalesce into this single, degrading ritual. It stripped away her title, her dignity, and the tentative connection she thought they were building, reducing her once again to a biological function, a vessel for their salvation. "Is that all I have ever been to you, Theron? A solution to your problem? A means to an end, to be tested like livestock?" The question was a raw wound, exposing the deepest insecurity of her new life. Theron's regal composure seemed to crack under the force of her pain. He moved towards her, his hands slightly raised in a gesture of placation that only fueled her anger. "Ilara, you must understand. This is not my wish. It is politics," he explained, his voice a low, urgent rumble. "Valerius has invoked an archaic law, one I cannot ignore without showing weakness. To refuse is to give his faction the proof they need, that our union is a failure, that I am a fool leading them to ruin. It would incite rebellion." He tried to frame it as a strategic necessity, a piece of political theatre they must endure for the greater good, but his logic was a cold comfort against the fire of her shame. He was speaking of kingdoms and factions, while her very soul felt like it was being put on public display, judged, and found wanting before the test had even begun. His pragmatism felt like a betrayal. "I don't care about your politics," she retorted, stepping back as he drew closer, creating a physical chasm to match the emotional one tearing them apart. "I care that you are asking me to stand before your people and be publicly assessed for my fertility. After everything, after your defense of me, I thought you were beginning to see me." Her voice broke on the last word. The pain was sharp and overwhelming. This ceremony invalidated every moment of connection, every shared glance, every quiet understanding. It was a cold, public declaration that their relationship was nothing more than a contract. "I will not do it," she whispered, her resolve hardening into a diamond shard of defiance. "Not unless you tell me the complete truth. No more secrets, Theron. What does the prophecy truly demand of me? What is it you have been hiding from me this entire time?" He stopped, the shadows of the library's towering shelves carving deep lines into his perfect face. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, he spoke, his voice stripped of all its royal authority, leaving only the sound of a weary, desperate man. "There is a time limit," he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The prophecy is not merely about a union. It states that an heir must be conceived within one cycle of the seasons from the moment of the binding. If not, the magic will fail." He paused, and the next words were even heavier. It will not simply fade, it will rebound. The fading will accelerate tenfold, and my people will be dust within a generation. The full moon for this rite of quickening, it marks the end of that cycle. We are out of time, Ilara. He had kept the secret to protect her from the crushing weight of it, but in doing so, he had built their entire connection on a lie of omission. The truth was a cold, cruel knife, twisting in the deepest part of her. Every kind word, every protective gesture, his furious defense of her in the council, it was all reframed, tainted by the frantic ticking of a hidden clock. She felt a wave of nausea, the dizzying sensation of having been the most naive fool in a game she didn't even know she was playing. So all of it was a lie, she breathed, the words hollow with grief. All of it was just you, trying to ensure your investment paid off before the deadline. The accusation hung between them, brutal and devastating. No, he said, taking a desperate step forward. It may have started that way, but it changed. When Valerius spoke of you with such contempt, it was not the future of my kingdom that I felt him attack. It was you, Ilara, only you. His voice was raw, laced with an emotion so profound it was almost a confession, a declaration of something more than just a pact. But his words, which might have once healed her, were now poison. The timing made them feel like the most desperate manipulation of all. She pulled away, her heart sealing itself in a casing of ice. The pain was too great, the betrayal too deep to allow for any other possibility. "You will have your ceremony," she stated, her voice flat and empty, a chilling echo in the vast, silent library. "Your queen will perform her duty." The scene shifted, dissolving to the grand terrace, bathed in the cold, silver light of the full moon. The entire elven court stood in silent, judgmental rows. Theron and Ilara approached the central dais from opposite ends, their faces pale and unreadable, their regal attire feeling like costumes in a tragedy. As an ancient priest raised a glowing crystal to the sky, his voice beginning the resonant chant of the rite of quickening, the chasm between the king and his human queen seemed as vast and cold as the night sky itself. The cold, silver light of the full moon washed over the grand terrace, stripping all warmth from the scene and transforming the assembled elven court into a gallery of silent, marble statues. At the center of the dais, Ilara and Theron stood on opposite sides of a glowing crystal, a physical representation of the vast, frozen chasm that had opened between them. An ancient priest, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, chanted the words of the rite of quickening, his incantations weaving a sterile net of magic in the frigid air. Ilara kept her face, a mask of regal indifference, but inside, every word of the ritual was a fresh lash of humiliation. She was performing her final duty as a vessel, a functionary in a desperate play, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She could feel hundreds of ancient eyes on her, judging her, waiting for her to fail, and she fully expected to grant them their wish. As the priest's chant reached its crescendo, the crystal pulsed, its light meant to flare into a brilliant beacon of life. Instead, it sputtered violently, the silver glow flickering like a dying candle before extinguishing into a wisp of grey smoke. A collective, horrified gasp swept through the court, a sound of doom that echoed in the sudden, profound silence. Lord Valerius stepped forward from the ranks of the council, his expression a perfect, sorrowful mask that did little to hide the triumphant glint in his eyes. "It is as we feared," he announced, his voice carrying across the terrace with chilling finality. "The union is barren. The mortal's life force is a chaotic, fleeting thing, incompatible with our own. The prophecy has failed." His words were a death sentence, not just for the elven race, but for Ilara's last shred of dignity, a public branding of her failure for all to see. Theron did not even glance at Valerius. His entire being was focused on Ilara, on the way her shoulders slumped, the flicker of utter devastation that broke through her stoic facade. In that instant, the weight of his crown, the fate of his people, all of it became secondary to the crushing pain he saw in her eyes. With a suddenness that startled the court, he crossed the dais, ignoring the priest and the dead crystal, and took her cold, trembling hands in his. "The magic has not failed," he declared, his voice a raw, powerful thunder that commanded absolute silence. "I have." He turned to face the stunned nobles, his grip on Ilara's hands tightening, a physical anchor in the storm. The prophecy did not ask for a broodmare, it asked for a true union, and I, in my fear and my pride, have treated this queen, my wife, as a contract to be fulfilled. The fault lies not in her spirit, but in my own cowardice." He turned back to Ilara, his amethyst eyes burning with 1,000 years of repressed emotion, a raw vulnerability that stripped him of his immortal majesty and left only a man. "When I defended you in the council, I was not defending an alliance. I was defending the woman whose courage shames my own, whose fierce heart has reignited a fire in my soul I thought long extinguished." He lifted her hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. "And this was never just a pact to me, not after I saw the strength it took to carry the world for your children, not after I felt the sheer force of your love. I hid behind my crown because I was a coward, Ilara, but no more. I love you." The confession, so brutally honest and unexpected, shattered the ancient stillness, a declaration of love that was also an act of rebellion against his entire world. The moment the words left his lips, a miracle occurred. The dormant magic of their binding, the intertwined threads of silver and gold, erupted not from the crystal, but from their joined hands. It was a warm, brilliant, and overwhelmingly powerful light that surged outwards, bathing the terrace in a life-giving glow. The grey-tinged flora in the gardens below shimmered, their colours deepening into vibrant life. A collective sigh swept through the elves as they felt a warmth, a surge of vitality that was the antithesis of the fading. The prophecy was not about a ritual, it was about the truth of the heart. Ignoring the awestruck court, Theron framed Ilara's face with his hands and kissed her, a desperate, profound kiss that sealed not a contract, but a destiny. And in that single, heartfelt union, the magic of a dying race was finally, gloriously reborn. In the seasons that followed, the Silverwood bloomed with a vitality it had not known in a millennium, the fading now a distant, sorrowful memory. The sound of laughter, once a foreign concept, now echoed through the crystalline halls, the bright, chaotic joy of Ilara's children mingling with the soft, wondrous chuckles of the first elven babies born in centuries. One evening, Theron stood with Ilara on that same terrace, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the stars. His hand rested gently on the soft swell of her belly, a silent promise of the heir who would embody their united worlds. Their journey, born of desperation, had forged a love that had not only saved a kingdom, but had built a new one. Their story is a testament that the greatest magic is found in the courage to love against all odds. If their journey touched your heart, please like, comment with your favorite moment, and subscribe for more.